26. The freedom of higher education. The university has also been bitterly criticised in recent years by its own members and friends. Thus, some faculty members have been very ready to see administrative power as the prime evil. This was perhaps best stated by J. McKean Cattell some years ago. In the academic jungle, the president is my black beast. I once incited one of my children to call her doll Mr. President on the esoteric grounds that he would lie in any position in which he was placed. Thorstein Veblen saw the evil in vocationalism, or professional schools in the university, which he deemed incompatible with true learning. Hutchins likewise saw a conflict between the pursuit of truth for its own sake and the preparation of men and women for their life work. This made university, in his eyes, anti-intellectual. The Christian presupposition that truth and calling are inseparable was nowhere in consideration in the thinking of either Veblen or Hutchins. Jaspers has called attention to the anti-intellectualism of the university as an institution. In appointments, the excellent are instinctively excluded from fear of competition, just as the inferior are rejected out of concern for the prestige and influence of the university. A more persistent charge is with reference to the radical inferiority of science departments. Some research scientists in private laboratories hold that not only could they give better advanced academic training, but that they often find it necessary to retain university graduates whom they employ. Other charges can be mentioned briefly in passing. Administrators state that professors, while ostensibly dedicated to higher learning and often contemptuous of the profit motive, are, whatever their pay, still as avaricious and status-conscious a group of men as ever existed. This charge can be dismissed in that it is equally true of great segments of the clergy and other non-profit callings. Nothing makes a man more prey to the most vicious avarice than to believe that his service to God, humanity, science, art, or scholarship makes him immune to particular sins. Similarly, it is charged that, inadequate as elementary and secondary schools may be, the failures of higher education are greater: more curriculum padding, more watering down of important subjects in the quest for popularity, more social passing, and more irrelevances exist in colleges and universities than in lower schools, where more public control exists. There is a measure of truth in this, but it is a charge equally applicable to church, state, and other spheres, in all of which such irrelevancies, typical of the end of an age, prevail. Again, it is charged quite frequently that professors, once having attained that eminence, lose interest in further learning and represents a low calibre of intellectual curiosity. Indeed, one faculty member has stated that the majority of his full professor colleagues limits their total annual reading to 1 or 2 periodicals. Such men then communicate the lust for position rather than of learning to their students. This is true, however, of most professional men, and some telling evidence of this professional lack of learning is cited by Dr. Sigerist. Our concern, however, is with principle rather than procedural issues. This concern is tellingly illustrated by a facetious quip. Why do Harvard men confuse themselves with God? Because they have a high opinion of God. With the Enlightenment, man became increasingly the new universal, supplanting God. The result was a Messianic utopianism which held that the approaching millennium would be a product of 1. Man's rejection of the past and of history in terms of his sovereign ability to create a new revolutionary culture. 2. Similarly, institutions and customs were to be rejected, since man's reason and science was to be the one true source of all these things. 3. It was further held that man is basically good, and that evil is not in man, but in his environment. 4. by changing human institutions, human nature itself will be born again. 5. The new managers of man will be the scientific moralists and lawgivers, the educators, the statesmen. Education in the modern age is a Messianic and utopian movement born of the Enlightenment's hope of regenerating man in and through his autonomous reason. This faith was greatly furthered by Kant's concept of the role of reason, whereby the ontological trinity was replaced by autonomous man and his reason. In man, being is exhausted in relation, and that relation is exclusively internal. Knowledge ceased to be the correlation of mind and matter, of the knower and reality, but rather became the synthesis, the unifying of human experience, the synthetic power of the mind. Knowledge is thus creative, constitutive, and interpretive. The world is man's representation, and the basic reality is the self, which is hence not an object of knowledge. Thus Kant heightened the Enlightenment faith. At times he spoke of the goodness of man as earlier thinkers of the Enlightenment had. Thus, evil is only the result of nature not being brought under control. In man there are only germs of good. But, he also asserted, but is man by nature morally good or bad? He is neither, for he is not by nature a moral being. His reason by its sway produces virtue, and his natural inclination, vice. Vices, for the most part, arise in this way, that civilization does violence to nature. Moral culture must be based upon maxims, not upon discipline. The one prevents evil habits, the other trains the mind to think. Maxims ought to originate in the human being as such. If we wish to establish morality, we must abolish punishment. The development in Kant becomes apparent, as the new universal man is, in a sense, beyond good and evil, as Nietzsche was more logically to assert, because he is himself the source of law and hence superior to it. His virtue is his freedom to be pure reason, and his dedication to this purpose and achievement in terms of it. Our ultimate aim is the formation of character. Character consists in the firm purpose to accomplish something, and then in the actual accomplishing of it. The developed creed of the Enlightenment is thus the authoritarian faith of the modern university, held as tenaciously as any medieval university held to its dogmas. This new quote-unquote Catholic faith is moreover held naively, in that it is assumed that the modern scholar, impartially, without prejudice or presupposition, seeks truth, when, in actuality, rigid presuppositions and axioms govern his every thought. The hardcore of doctrine of this new Catholic faith includes the following ideas. 1. The autonomy of man and of his reason are assumed, and the penetrability of all things to man's reason and its scientific or philosophical methodology. Thus, what cannot be comprehended by this methodology or measured by it is not real. While man will not limit reality to what the baboon can grasp, he does limit it to his own apprehensibility, since man and not God or the baboon is the measure and the true universal. 2. The evolutionary hypothesis is similarly assumed as an article of faith. 3. The natural order is assumed to be self-sufficient and a law in and of itself. 4. Education is held to be the instrument of social salvation. 5. The state is viewed as the primary order of man's life. 6. The primary responsibility and accountability of man to man, as against man to God, is maintained. 7. True learning is of necessity assumed to be religiously secular, that is, divorced from God, and academic freedom requires a radical absolution from all theistic ties. 8. The priority of science and learning to ethics, and the determination of true ethics by means of autonomous man's own resources is maintained. Furthermore, even as morality is subordinate to and a product of human activity and intelligence, so true religion is subordinate to and a product of ethics. 9. Intelligence is the desired and necessary agency of social planning and control. 10. Evil is a social product because man is essentially a passive creature, so that the moral education of the individual is purely and simply the management of his environment. The mind is passive in that its every activity or idea is empirically aroused. Nothing can exist in the mind that is not first in the senses. While in the Kantian sense knowledge is not the correlation of mind and object, it is still passive in that it is the synthesis which stimulus produces. Thus, delinquency is not seen as more than a response, that is, to a lack of love in the environment, and social evils as responses to environmental factors. Activity is hence seen as conditional and responsive, and thus the assumption of the basic passivity and ostensible malleability of the mind. 11. Nature is infinite and uncreated, hence the problem in economics and life is not one of limitations of creation and of scarcity, but a problem of distribution and use. Many of these tenets characterize the 19th century college, but the facade of Christian faith nonetheless prevailed, albeit a Christian position syncretistically maintained at best. However, there was enough opposition to one or more of these tenets to make the 19th century a relatively dark period to the modern champions of academic freedom. Some universities were founded by men with a generally religious outlook, whose presidents, however, rapidly made the new institutions leaders of the new faith. Basic to the modern university and its concept of its role as well as of its academic freedom is, as Metzger has clearly seen, its rejection of doctrinal moralism. This assault on doctrinal moralism was mounted on two major premises: the ethical neutrality of science and the experimental status of ethics. This ethical neutrality has been maintained inconsistently at times, but is nonetheless basic to the modern university, as is the experimental status of ethics. The university and its scholar are thus beyond good and evil. The clearest and indeed only expression of consistent doctrinal moralism, which subordinates both man and moralism to a theological faith, is Orthodox Christianity. As the Westminster Divine stated it, truth is in order to goodness. That is, character, morality, and true goodness cannot exist in any true sense apart from the foundation of truth, truth which is to be identified only with the personal God of Scripture and His Word and its order of knowledge. This faith is an affirmation of universal causality of a personal nature. Cause and effect move thus in terms of the absolute and personal will of a personal God. For the modern university, if causality exists, it is only an impersonal causality and hence ultimately indifferent to the matter of personal morality. As a result, in terms of this ultimate impersonalism, man's salvation is technological and scientific, and so to be sought, rather than in terms of faith and obedience to a very personal and jealous God. For Orthodox Christianity, it is not a question of manipulation and control, but rather of faith and obedience, not external works. To the extent that a theology allows the existence of an unconscious potentiality in God, to that extent it allows for the efficacy of works rather than of faith. Man's faith today is in an impersonal universe and an impersonal or slightly personal God, and hence his hope is in technology and science, in manipulation and control. But to presuppose an ultimate impersonalism is to assume, as a necessary consequence, the priority and determinative power of an immediate impersonalism. Hence, for Freud, man is basically governed by subpersonal and subconscious forces. Hence, for Dewey, man is basically social and not personal. Hence, too, external means are basic to his life and welfare. Chemistry will cure his mental illness, and techniques his social, sexual, and personal problems. A cosmic impersonalism leads inevitably to the depersonalization of man. The effects of the rejection of doctrinal moralism have been most clearly seen in those areas of culture which are new to the 20th century, as witness motion pictures and television. As an anthropologist has pointed out, Hollywood's predominant approach to life is one of radical mechanization and impersonalization, so that love, life, and all things are reduced to techniques of manipulation and control. According to Dr. Powdermaker, Hollywood represents totalitarianism. In Hollywood, the concept of man as a passive creature to be manipulated extends to those who work for the studios, to personal and social relationships, to the audiences in the theatres, and to the characters in the movies. Hollywood has the elaborated totalitarian elements we have described, the concept of people as property and as objects to be manipulated, highly concentrated and personalized power for power's sake, an immorality and an atmosphere of breaks, continuous anxiety and crises. Here, ironically from the lips of a university scholar, is a pointed description of the consequences of the very faith held by the modern university, albeit held with more sophistication. It's not surprising that a comparison between Dr. Powdermaker's Hollywood and the university reveal very real similarities. Self-pity and a martyr complex seem moreover to characterize the modern professor, as he finds society reluctant to accept his gospel of total manipulation. The rejection of doctrinal moralism is the rejection of personal responsibility. The resultant concept of academic freedom is a demand for total license and a freedom from all consequence. It is the lust for a world without personal consequence and an unwillingness to risk anything for one's faith. This concept of academic freedom, wedded as it is increasingly to pragmatism and relativism, holds in effect that nothing matters whether the man is atheistic, Marxist, or a sexual pervert, if he is competent in his field. But in this sea of relativism, what can be called competence? And if intelligence be made a criterion, on what ground is it held to have value? And as for Dewey's standard of the great community, what gives that community any value in a valueless world? The doctrine of academic freedom, as held today, has no foundation other than autonomous man's claims to be the universal as he manifests himself as a reasoner and researcher. It is thus a modern and totally immanent version of an ancient dogma, divine right. In the theory of academic freedom, this divine right is now incarnate in the university and its scholar, and is hence beyond all law. The scholar has thus been instrumental in overthrowing the divine right of church, state, and artist, but only to assert its own claim. This trend was not challenged, but rather furthered by John Henry Cardinal Newman by his insistence on the supremacy of human reason. Newman's position was that this autonomous reason, if true to itself, would ultimately be true to God. But the fallacy of this position was its failure to recognize that basic to this faith in the autonomous mind is the claim of that reason to function as God rather than reason. Another brilliant religious attempt to wed faith and the university is seen in George Hunston Williams' hope that man may be citizen of 3 cities, of Jerusalem, which is the church of all ages and climes, of Athens, which is the university where reason, that's in us, whereby we, all of his creatures, reflect uniquely the image of the Creator, is free to pursue its inquiries to the very brink of human perception and of the city of man, the free society grounded in law. This is to be under the continuous and searching judgment of Christ. But, as in every merger, priority goes to a particular partner, although he believes very earnestly in the Christological sanction of the spiritual autonomy of the Christian professor. Williams regrettably finds in the Synoptic Gospels faint echoes within echoes of oral tradition. Since the only Christ who can be known is the Christ reconstructed by the professors, the continuous and searching judgment of that Christ is more likely to be, and usually has been, a letter of marque for the academic privateers of liberal Protestantism. Quote-unquote Christian education in the 19th century was non-theological, and there is no evidence of any real change in its character since then. Harbison, for example, rejects the idea of a Christian curriculum with a Christian sociology or the like. There is, for him, no full revelation of God in history, only a balance between concealment and revelation, which the Christian has to find. When ostensibly Christian thinkers have been so lacking in any substantial answer to the prevailing relativism, it is not surprising that the direction of educational theory proceeds more rapidly than ever towards the vast ocean of inchoate relativism. Within the ranks of the scholars themselves, there has been discontent. Reisman, in criticizing anthropological relativism, has commented, "As many observers have pointed out, it was all very well to seek neutrality towards the exotic behavior of the vanishing Dobrans or Nanda, but not towards the racist behavior of the Nazis or the suppression of cultural pluralism and the extirpation of whole peoples in the Soviet Union." The problem, however, is not easily solved. How can neutrality be set aside in one realm when posited for all reality? How can any absolute be introduced into a sea of relativity? If democracy be introduced, as some would do, as a moral standard against the vast realm of neutrality, Mark Van Doren's observation holds true that there is no such thing as democratic morals and ideals. Morals are either bad or good. Majorities do not ensure morality. If attempts be made to develop and enforce a group conscience, the problem remains how a conscience can be developed with reference to an ultimate relativism. Biddle has declared that growth of responsible personalities is the basic aim of all education. Responsible to whom? When man is himself the universal, there can be no question of responsibility. Man is a law unto himself. If the group is the universal, then there is no value apart from the democratic majority or any appeal against it. As Fustel de Coulanges has shown in The Ancient City, the absence of transcendence was the roots and ground of tyranny and the impossibility of freedom. Man had no frame of reference beyond himself or his group. In the closed universe of modern thought, that is, a universe without transcendence and wholly comprehensible in terms of itself, man is also wholly comprehended by his society, appetites, and his subconscious. His reason itself is passive, an evolutionary, racial, and social product. As a result, he has no law to appeal to against his group or against himself for deliverance from himself. Total tyranny is the inevitable product of every closed universe in human thought. Only the open universe of biblical faith allows for true transcendence and for human liberty. And the hand of the modern intellectual is raised against the true transcendence of the ontological Trinity. Holmes well expressed this temper in a letter to Lasky. "I detest a man who knows that he knows." University scholars have of late begun to join the ranks of anti-intellectual intellectualism, although not without resistance from some, as witness Jacques Barzin, the house of intellect. But the lack of any true concept of freedom is all too clear. During World War II, the universities saw the virtual suspension of liberal education with scarcely a murmur. It was no longer seen as essential to true liberty and was an expendable luxury. A committee of the American Council of Learned Societies, writing during that war, observed that our greatest weakness today is our lack of genuine culture. Such culture as existed was seen as, in a sense, retrogressive because technology and mechanization had gained priority over traditional cultural values. Nothing is more amazing than the forms of idolatry which have shown themselves through the ages. It seems hardly credible that men would make a golden calf and then worship the product of their own workmanship. Yet something of the same fear and awe appeared in the 20th century attitudes toward the machine. As a result of the basic impersonalism of contemporary philosophies, the university and college have moved steadily to the left, to politics and economics of manipulation and control. Lazarsfeld's and Thielen's might call the new attitude permissive in their study of the academic mind, but it is more clearly to be defined as statist, and it is in clear-cut revolt against individualism and against freedom. The long-standing demand for federal assistance has accordingly been stepped up. Two challenges to the neutralism of the modern university have arisen in recent years, both denying the moral neutralism as well as denying the myth of scholarly objectivity. Both, however, were philosophies of a closed universe. These challenges came from the Nazi German and the Soviet Russian universities. The German universities surprised the world by their readiness to turn to the Nazis. In so doing, they were, 1. Reacting against the liberal myth of inherent equality in favour of another myth, inherent racial superiority. 2. They were reacting against the myth of objectivity in favour of a new existential subjectivism. 3. They were reacting against the myth of relativism in favour of an immanent concept of truth as comprehended and manifested in the process of the German nation. This was, of course, simply a form of the Hegelian dialectic, which also commands the allegiance of Soviet Russia. The Soviet-Russian university was not so radical as the Nazi university in its break with the past, retaining in part the liberal mythology and also the liberal incarnation of process in the state rather than the race. This belief, however, of the Marxist scholar in this bastard version of quote-unquote truth and his insistence on the reality of truth has given him in Western universities a power far beyond his numbers. The Marxist professor, as a crusader for truth and a believer in the reality of his Hegelian Marxist truth, has had a compelling power as he teaches in the midst of academic relativism. As the world crisis has deepened, the popularity of the relativists has given way in turn to the Marxists, and now, with disillusionment over their tyrannies, to a new and implicitly religious, as well as explicitly political and economic conservatism. By and large, however, the university is content to see its problem as basically twofold: a need for more money and a need for more license so that it can indulge in that total irresponsibility which it calls academic freedom. But, as Stanley Baldwin once observed, power without responsibility is the prerogative of the harlots throughout the ages.